This is going to be a recording of a chat or discussion about Catholic Lecture 241, The Dynamics of Resistance. In the study guide that I published, that's on my website, I break it down and talk about different kinds of resistance. For this talk, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. What I'm trying to do is give many perspectives to the lecture, with the hope that you'll read the lecture, with the hope that you'll find something that is of value to you to help you with the concepts. So in this particular section, I want to make 4 or 5 primary points. First is that resistance is always a reaction to death. And this refers back to the many, many times in the study guides and the lectures that the guide refers to dualistic thinking. And dualistic thinking is where we fall into almost an unconscious sense of having perceived something as death, and then anything else is life. It can work. It never works the opposite, but it can appear in an opposite way. We may find something that's life-affirming and hold on to it, but there's an unconscious death that we're avoiding, a non-life affirming that we're avoiding. And our ignorance of that doesn't change the fact that we are running away by holding on to life. So you can unmask dualistic thinking by either seeing what you consider to be death, loss, destruction, change. Or you can look at what you're holding on to and just look over your shoulder and ask, what is the holding trying to avoid? So point number 1 is that resistance is always a reaction to the specter of death in some form. So the second point is that it can be very important to find what you're running away from. It may be hard to do so, but it's important. So like I say, you can either try to look towards what you're afraid of, or you can do a game of opposites. If I'm holding onto this, what's the opposite end of the dumbbell? The third point is to try to see how you are running away from it. And this is where it gets very complicated and very individualistic. So I'm going to name some ways that we run away with their Pathwork lecture references. And the majority of these I've already done videos and study guides for. One of the ways we try to avoid death is through the manifestation of personality types. And there are many lectures on the personality types of reason, will, and emotion. The main one is Pathwork Lecture 43. One about the distortions is Pathwork Lecture 84. Personality types refer to how we have manifested in this lifetime. They may not reflect who we are in spirit. And by that I mean that from a spiritual place, if we need to learn about love, we may build a personality that is more reason-based, anti-fuzzy-wuzzy love. We don't need that. So that we drive ourselves into tighter and tighter, more and more controlled situation, so that we actually feel the lack of disorganized, messy, wonderful love. So that at the end of our lifetime, we open to it, like a flower opens to rain. Whereas before we thought it was wet. Now we see it as life affirming. So the personality type may be created in order to create a lack of something we need to learn about. The personality type may be created in order to immerse ourselves in what we already have in abundance, but that we have something to learn about that. What's tricky about this work is that every person's story is truly unique in some way, and every person's spiritual path is partly unknown and can only be intuited and can only be genuinely intuited by them. So from the outside, we can be generic. We can counsel about grief. We can counsel about integrity. Lots of things can be counseled about. But the truth of who we are and what we're trying to do can only truly be accessed by ourselves. And the goal of this work is to get us in such a state of transparency that we are able to see past our defenses and the things I'm going to list, and see what our soul came here to learn. That's why this is spiritual work and not psychotherapy. So that's the personality types, Pathwork Lecture 43 and 84, the primary lectures on that. Another way to run away is Pathwork Lecture 77, which is self-confidence. And in the lecture on self-confidence is the best description of forcing currents. They didn't put it in the title, but that's what it's great at describing. And a forcing current, the best way I can describe that is a little bit of science here. The easy way for a restaurant to keep flies out of the restaurant is to create positive airflow. So they are bringing in ventilated air through screens, and they are blowing the air through the restaurant, and the air is escaping out the door whenever anybody comes in. And flies and mosquitoes can't fly against the wind. So every time someone opens the door, or even those plastic segmented curtains, every time somebody comes in, there's a positive rush of air that pushes flies and bugs away from the door to keep the restaurant relatively insect-free, flying insect-free. In the personality, what a forcing current can look like is generating lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm. It can also manifest as generating lots of anger. Now, that seems contradictory. But if you're very, very angry, then you're focused on the outside and you're not looking inside, and it is looking inside that we're afraid to do. When you're generating a lot of cheerleader energy, you're not doing introspective work. So forcing currents aren't bad, they're neutral, they just are. It's important to understand the concept to realize where you're in one. Now today, as I'm speaking to you, I have less forcing current, less cheerleader energy than I normally do. I'll explain that in a bit. And because of that, I am able to contemplate things that I haven't contemplated in this way before. Had some personal thoughts and process that allow me to go deeper into some issues than I'm normally able to do. So that's why a forcing current is a form of resistance. It takes us away from an issue. It can be constructive, it can be powerful and wonderful. But like everything in life, like a hammer, it can be used to build a building or destroy something. So it's how we use it that makes the difference. Another concept for resistance is building an idealized self-image, which is explained in Pathwork Lecture 83. In building an idealized self-image, we build a picture of ourselves. This is who I am. And my idealized self-image, just as the words say, is an ideal. It is the best of who I am. Nobody can be that all the time. When we build an image and we're constantly trying to meet the image, we don't break apart, we don't fall down, we don't need maintenance or repair work, because we feel that we must always be that perfect being. And if not a perfect being, we need to be what other people expect us to be. So again, using me as an example, I appear differently to people in the last few weeks. And that invites, oh, are you okay? Which invites a conversation that normally I would not like to have. I can hold that off by saying, I'm fine, thank you, and how are you? What I'm bringing up here is that can be resistance because I'm resistant to engaging honestly with people, and I want to stay in my persona, the person they're used to seeing. Another aspect of resistance can be perfectionism, which is Pathwork Lecture 97. A feeling that if we're not perfect, we're garbage. Well, garbage is a cliche, it's an exaggeration that really means we have some issues to work on. But if that's going to lead us to something we're not prepared to work on, that feels like death. So the answer is to try to be perfect. It's very similar to the idealized self-image, but it may cover more ground. Intolerance for mistakes of any kind, because we feel that if we make a mistake, then we are vulnerable. Remember that this is spiritual work, not psychotherapy. So while we personify being attacked by other people attacking us, ultimately we're afraid of the judgment of God, the creator of the universe. So there are many, many levels to our resistance. There's a lecture called The Defense, Pathwork Lecture 101. And in that lecture, the guy constantly talks about the poisonous substance that we misuse. It is interesting to me that the guide simply will not use the word adrenaline, which is the poisonous substance he's talking about. There must be a reason why he focused his words on poisonous substance without being chemically accurate. By emphasizing the poisonous substance, basically what he was saying was we go into defense for the wrong reasons unnecessarily, and we're dumping adrenaline into our body, and it will take its toll. It will harm our health. So taking a substance that is wonderful for fight or flight and using it to avoid social errors is a misuse of the substance. And over the long run will exhaust us. We will exhaust our adrenal glands and not have them available for actual emergencies. So the lecture on the defense is about how we overuse our defensive systems. The hormonal system being an example. Then there's a lecture called Ego Tricks, Pathwork Lecture 199. That's not the actual name, that's what we call it. And in the lecture on ego tricks, the guide talks about a whole bunch of things that you might not associate with defense and resistance, such as confusion. What do you mean confusion is a defense? What he's referring to is allowing confusion to be the end of the road, allowing confusion to truncate. Self-search, self-analysis, self-examination. I'm just confused, ending this conversation. I'm just confused, ending the search. And that's why it's an ego trick. The ego doesn't want to go there. And the ego shouldn't have to go there by itself. Once again, this is spiritual work. And the invitation is to bring in more of our spiritual self. And the ego is a part of our human self. And to do this together. But when the ego is left by itself without spiritual support, it becomes overwhelmed very easily. And it basically traffic manages. Like a bureaucrat who simply relies on rules instead of taking risks or looking for an opportunity for leadership. So confusion, deliberate ignorance, which is also a very dicey concept, a place where you could know more than you do, but you have chosen not to, so technically you are ignorant. But you don't have to be as ignorant as you are, and you can work on the ignorance. But when we simply say, I don't understand, I don't know anything about that, we're closing doors. We're trying to close doors. Sometimes an ego trick can be, and I'm talking about more than what's actually in the lecture, it can be a form of interference. Substance abuse can be a form of resistance, a way of taking us out of the game, taking us out of the conversation, destroying our ability to think clearly. Because when we think clearly, we can't figure out what's going on, we see nothing but pain, and so we opt out. In seeing substance abuse as a form of last-ditch defense against not being prepared for personal process work, you can see where therapeutic support during unhitching ourselves from substance abuse is critical. Because as we unnumb, we stop numbing ourselves, and we face life, all the demons we ran away from are going to be in our face. Also, the idea is that substance abuse is multidimensional. When we eat the chemicals that are released from the digestion of our food are going to change the chemistry of our body. Drinking water changes the chemistry of our body. Sugar, starch, protein, vitamin, all of this changes chemistry in our body. Wearing tight clothes changes the way our blood flows. It numbs us, in a sense. Overactivity releases hormones that make us feel good without actually having done specific deeds that make us feel good. Speaking a little hyperbole here. But if you get your good feelings from running, then you're not drawn to continue getting good feelings from activities. It can become a substitute. And so that's where I'm suggesting that there's a form of substance abuse in anything that takes us away from a fully balanced life, including work. Neurotic behavior can be a way of hiding. We can secretly enjoy focusing on our OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, as a way of avoiding self-analysis, looking at our life, to the point where we can't see that it was a choice, and it's very hard to undo. So speaking of all these things lovingly, so there's also resistance in destructive behavior. When we behave destructively, there's a lot of drama and exaggeration and opportunity for falsehood and confusion. And being involved in destructive situations is also a way to escape a spiritual reality that we are not yet willing to face or unable to face without some help. The reason my energy system is different today is that my 44-year-old son died last week from a sudden heart attack. Every parent, everyone who loses a loved one has a form of this, but it's really deep in parents. Goes through what if, should I, why didn't I? You're flooded with a sense of, how could I have stopped this? Did he know I loved him? What, blah, 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 blah. And I've had my turn at that. However, what happened last week was I also began to notice, and please forgive my using metaphor and analogy, but I don't necessarily have words that communicate my actual feelings. So I see things in images and stories. I accused myself of not loving him enough. And when I did that, I felt as if there was a thorn in me. Something that had been put on a spear and been driven into me. It wasn't me, it was a thorn that said, you are unloving. I can't explain why I experienced it differently last week than I have before, but it was clearly a different feeling. And I knew it had come from my childhood. My mother agreed, according to pathwork, when a child comes into the world, it has the spiritual permission from its parents. It can't come in without spiritual permission, because when a kid comes in, it changes your life. Got to have permission. In that spiritual exchange, we might be perfectly honest with each other. Hi, how are you? I'm going to come in. I need to learn this. I'm going to mess your life up a lot. I'm going to just tear you limb from limb. And I think that's going to help you. And from a spiritual perspective, I would say, wow, that would be awesome. I don't think anybody could get through my thick head unless I dealt with something like that. So yeah, you come on in. Why do I do a comedy routine? It's easier. Pathwork taught me to embrace my relationship with my son in that sense. It was very hard. He was disabled 25 years ago, cognitively and physically. It's been quite a drama for 25 years. And at that time, because I was broken, I opened to pathwork. In that sense, my son broke through my defenses by trying to hide from life and brought me into life. In that sense, my son saved my life by taking a radical turn in his. In the place where I accuse myself of not loving, that comes from my childhood, I also made a contract with my mother. And I think my mother's journey with me was equally difficult. And on a spiritual level, she said, yes, come on in. Might help. And so she gave birth to a sensitive introvert who's going to wind up being a pathwork helper. And that's not who she was. And she wanted a family so badly. She was counting on a family because she hadn't had one. So with the most incredible tidal wave of love, she tried to attach to me. And I felt overwhelmed. I felt as if I would die. And so I withdrew. And that set up a dynamic for our entire lives. In defense, my mother looked for a reason why this wasn't working. And one of her many excuses, justifications, attempts to understand, She accused me, not necessarily in words, but in energetic communications. She accused me of not being loving. I took it in. That's my responsibility. I took it in because it's one of the things I came here to learn. I came here to learn that that's not true. And in order to learn it, I needed to experience this isometric tension for my entire life of believing I wasn't loving because my mother didn't get what she wanted, versus being loving and yet not letting it in, letting that truth come in. Now, where this converges with this lecture, and that's why I brought it up, I'm going to do a thing with my hands now to try to explain this, because it's a complicated dynamic. This hand is going to represent love and truth. And this hand is going to represent lies. Okay? So we're going to start with the fact that I am a loving person. And early in my life, a lie entered. I'm not going to blame anybody. I signed up for this. A lie entered and said, you're not loving. And it activated me my whole life to do loving things, to try to find the place where I could be seen and heard and understood as having a loving heart. But the problem was I was reacting to a lie. What I found last week was the last piece, I hope, of this lie. And I could feel that I am a loving person. And I could feel how I worked so hard all my life to be loving, to prove my loving. But proving you're loving is a forcing current instead of just being loving. So I'm working right now on removing this last fragment of this lie so that I am loving and I naturally do loving things, but not in reaction, not to prove against a lie. Now, I'm going to show you an opposite version. It goes like this. This piece is not loving. This soul is not loving. And this represents saying the truth. I am not a loving person. And this represents attempts to disprove that or send away criticism. This is destructive. Neither one of these is necessarily destructive if they are true. It is an act of love to say I have an issue. So underneath I am not loving is a desire to be loving. Why else would you admit you're not? Once again, this is spiritual work. And the premise is that we're spiritual beings who have come here to learn. And sometimes the learning is harsh. Sometimes the learning is painful. It has supported me for 25 years, my understanding of Pathfic lectures. That what happens in life is meant to support me, but also to challenge my defenses. And like the ocean bashing against a break wall. If that break wall is not supposed to be there, the ocean's job is to get rid of it. It's just to get rid of it, day in and day out until the break wall crumbles. And that's part of what my life has been like. Now, you're not supposed to see all of this when you're 30 or 40 or even 50 or even 60. Because There's a time to be in it and a time to begin to have a more objective viewpoint. It has been my observation that more and more people are able to see these realities sooner. And in a tiny piece of negativity, my attitude was, what? Took me 40 years, you can't do it when you're 30, which is a variation of the joke about when I was your age, I walked 6 miles through the snow to school. It's not loving. It is challenging to me to see where my life could have taken a different turn earlier, and I wouldn't have had to live so destructive of life for as long until I was jolted out of it. But that's my story. It doesn't have to be your story. So that's an attempt to give you an overview to Pathwork Lecture 241. Now, I have a couple people who have been listening out of the kindness of their hearts, because it is easier for me to do these presentations with talking to real people as well as knowing that it will be uploaded. So I'll ask if anybody has a question or a comment to make. They are welcome to make it at this time before we close.
Hi, Jan.
Hi.
This is a very technical kind of thing, but my heart was kind of leaping each time you mentioned a Pathwork lecture that met a particular theme. And I just wonder if you could include that in even the description of the video. I just would find it really helpful to go reference those by theme. Even though you say they're on your website, it just is a shortcut for coming back. I do like to listen to these again, and maybe I would, pick up one of those if I saw it in print also. So that's my very generic comment.
I'm happy to include the links in the notes that I will send you. And also, I'll go ahead and put those links in the text under the YouTube video.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm excited about the prospect of tackling some of those areas with accompaniment. Every time I hear you say, the guide says, it's just encouragement that, it doesn't take inventing a wheel from scratch. Mm-hmm. We can look inward and learn to know what we know, and sometimes it's just really nice to have a little boost. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Anyone else before we close?
Yes, thanks, Jen. I wondered if you could speak to the idea that a forcing current is simply neutral and not negative.
Okay. The guide teaches, I'm going to give the example of a hammer again. A hammer is not destructive or constructive. It's simply a tool. It's a hammer. A car is a moving vehicle. It can also be a weapon of destruction. It's in the news this week. It can also be a life-saving vehicle. It can take people to the hospital. It can enlarge our lives and take us to places. The car itself is neutral. A forcing current is not inherently constructive or destructive. It's not inherently good or bad. The guide says nothing is inherently good or bad, including evil. Now that's hard to get. So let me go there for just a second. Evil's power is in deceiving us into embracing it. Now, I've never met an evil being. I don't doubt that they exist. I've heard people talk about evil beings. The people that I have met who do evil acts are people who have blinded themselves so much out of pain and distortion that they aren't fully conscious of what they're doing. And they justify or they rationalize, but they've lost their way. And they think that killing people will bring them closer to God. In some sense, that's true. Because at some point, spiritually, you're going to wake up and realize what you've done. But there are other ways to do that. So, forcing currents. If you think of forcing currents like positive airflow, and you use positive airflow to chase insects away when your food is rotten, you're chasing away getting objective feedback. If you saw flies flocking to something, you might realize that it was giving off an odor that it might be bad meat, for instance. So by using a forcing current, you are on some level avoiding a knowledge of what would happen when the forcing current is turned off. So my reference to it today, as far as I'm concerned, is I haven't got the energy for a forcing current this week. And that means that I feel vulnerable in a way I haven't felt for a long time. But the truth is, I'm not vulnerable. I know how to defend myself. I spent my whole life defending myself. I'm very expert at defending myself. What I am not expert at is taking a risk of telling the truth. Instead of my neighbor saying, "How are you?" and I saying, "Fine," and going on my way, of my saying, "Well, I just come back from a funeral and it's been hard." It doesn't ruin their day to hear that. It allows them to connect with me. It's an opportunity to connect with someone instead of, "How are you? Fine. How are you? Fine." Now I'm going to check back. Do you understand how I'm seeing a forcing current under those examples, Dennis?
Yes, I do. I guess the word forcing to me implies something that is less than neutral. But thank you.
Yes. So operating a motor vehicle involves some conscious effort. If you don't get the car and get in it and turn the ignition switch and start to drive, you can't drive a car. There needs to be some energy put into that. There's some physics in this. I love physics that involve words like entropy and momentum and lots of things, and velocity. And in that sense, a forcing current is artificial. You are forcing the energy to go down a certain channel. But it may need to. We may need to force it before the channel is more available to us. I'll give you a petty example. We teach a child manners. We teach a child to write thank you notes. We may not write thank you notes when we're older. We may make a phone call or make an effort to have lunch with someone or do a Facebook or email thing. But with a child, we're trying to teach appreciation for a gift. So we're artificially creating a mechanism for the child to write a note and fold it and stamp it and send it a mechanical way. And what we're really wanting to do is bring up a feeling of gratitude. Thank you for the gift. So that would be an example that's forced. Kids don't do that out of the blue. They need to, it takes them a while. Later they might do it out of the blue. But the first time, it's a very artificial thing to write a letter of thank you to someone who's giving you a gift. So that's the sense I understand forcing current in. It's like using crutches to get you going. But we forget we're using crutches. And we start relying on them so that we don't know what it's like to operate without crutches. Once you have an appreciation for forcing currents, for that energy, you then have the ability to put the crutches down on occasion. And it needs to be done considerately. You put them down 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day under certain circumstances. You don't rip them out or throw them away. That's not going to be helpful. You need to develop the skills that those crutches were supporting you when you weren't able to do it. So in that sense, there's a forcing, like crutches will force you upright and force you along the city streets in a way that you could not manage in certain injuries. But becoming dependent on them, having them become invisible is the issue, not using them when they're appropriate. So let me check in with you.
Thank you. That's fine.
Okay. Anything else before we close? So thank you for listening today. I hope those that are watching the video read the lecture. It's a cool lecture. Patrick Lecture 241, Dynamics of Pessimism. Thank you.